Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to a very special Power Rangers Top 10. We've talked plenty about the great heroes that define the franchise, so it's only right to now shift our focus to the greatest villains. Just like a great ranger or a great supporting character, a great villain can enhance the season he or she comes from. And while some villains were only evil because an antagonist was needed for the season, the ones that truly stand out prove to be a bit more complex and interesting, and sometimes not even all that evil. So, with all that said, let's kick things off with number 10. Villamax gets the slightest of edges over several antagonists that have longevity on their side, mainly because one of his biggest and most important jobs was making Trakenna an overall better villain, and he succeeded. But what really makes him interesting is the fact that he's an antagonist, but not really a villain. He even comes with his own moral code, a concept completely foreign to most Ranger antagonists before him, several of whom would without hesitation backstab their own comrades just to get ahead. And just like far too many members of the Stark family, his honor does him in, despite being a loyal and fearless servant of Trakenna's. It's a heartbreaking and perfect moment where all he wants is an end to the madness Trakenna has wrought, and doesn't even fight back when he's challenged. It functions as a climax to Trakenna's own character arc, where power consumes her completely, and she has officially discarded everything and everyone that once worked under her. Villamax is a character that was about way more than just destroying the Rangers and never even considered ruling the galaxy, which makes him interesting and even somewhat relatable. He wasn't around for very long, relatively speaking, but made a sizable impact on an all-time great season. One of the greatest aspects of In Space as a season was it being the first Ranger season to effectively tie the heroes to the villains and allow that to create the story, and with that came Ecliptor. What separates him from the somewhat similar Villamax is the fact that Ecliptor was built to be evil, a veteran of who knows how many past space battles, and yet contains very human emotions. He essentially raised Astronema himself and feels very protective of her from the very beginning of the show, and springing from that emotional side of his comes the most crucial detail to his character. His love for Astronema supersedes his evil programming, as is proven when Astronema learns of her past as Corone, but Ecliptor is still as willing as ever to protect her even at the cost of his own life. Even after his brainwashing, or more accurately reprogramming in his case, he still managed to cling to some of that humanity in the final fight. Despite the fact that Ecliptor and Andros battled the entire season, in the end, they both wanted the same thing. And even though Zordon's sacrifice had the unfortunate side effect of destroying him, Ecliptor will not soon be forgotten. What makes Trakenna a great villain is the same thing that makes the Lost Galaxy team great characters: progression. She began as just a side villain, not really capable of too much compared to Deviot or even Furio early on. There's a ton of Ranger villains that either never improve or never even get up half the time, but Trakenna eventually aspires to improve herself and do more for the cause. That mentality led her to Villamax, who trains her to fend for herself, all while Scorpius is getting set up for a fall. Then her arc becomes about both becoming a better villain and avenging her father. But the smartest thing Lost Galaxy does with her character is allow her to descend into madness before eventually losing, because that contradicts with the way that the Rangers were able to come to terms with the multitude of sacrifices surrounding them this season. She fails because she threw away every connection, sacrificed everyone but herself, and gives in to her lust for power, making the final battle here probably the most narratively significant one in all of Power Rangers. Trakenna had a lot to live up to in the aftermath of the Princess of Evil, and while she's not quite as good as Astronema overall, her development as a villain makes her one of the best in the franchise. After recently watching through all of Time Force, I'm convinced Frax is actually the most evil individual there. Most of us know about the central Time Force theme of changing your destiny that applies to most of the main characters. But in the case of the former Dr. Frax, that development occurs in the opposite direction, as he himself explains near the end of the season. He used to be a kind, compassionate person, But after Ransik betrayed him and nearly killed him, he set his sights fully on revenge. And while a ton of villains wouldn't even think twice about betraying each other, Frax actually has a reason to. A reason that he carefully hides until he sees a perfect time to strike. And adding more intrigue to the villain side of the story pretty much always results in a better season of Power Rangers. And the way he betrayed Ransik, crushing all of his serum vials, going after his one real vulnerability as opposed to just attacking him, was brilliant and absolutely cold-blooded. And it's one of several ways that Time Force shows how easy slipping into madness can be. Even Jen has some trouble early on keeping it together because of everything the mutants have put her through. And through it all, Frax evolved from a well-designed evil sidekick to the one who almost beat the Rangers on several occasions, making him one of the all-time best. The Power Rangers equivalent of Skynet with a little bit of Ultron mixed in ended billions of lives. With a B, billions. What started out as a simple computer virus built an army of machines, waged war on the planet, and basically won, save one city. Being the Ranger villain that tops all the others in terms of coming the closest to actually conquering the planet automatically places Venjix on this list. But what then makes him high on this list are the layers that went into him. He didn't just want to kill all humans, he wanted to turn them into him, which ends up being an important part of his endgame. So, one of the major R.P.M. plot points focused on the only two known survivors of those experiments at the time. But it goes beyond that, because Venjix really is one of the smartest villains in Ranger history, which he kind of had to be in order to convince us that he actually did end billions of lives. His Monster of the Week tactics weren't just, oh no, some strange creature is attacking the abandoned quarry again. Almost every robot he creates has a strategy built into it, a purpose behind it, be it biochemical, informational, disruptive, or just straight up destructive. And when those plans fall short, he is not shy about building himself a body to go after the Rangers personally, because even a rogue computer virus knows that good leaders lead by example. And I think there's something to be said for nearly ending the world because of the simplest of things. Dr. K, as we later find out, created the Venjix virus just as a way to go outside, which really makes you wonder if the faceless think tank that trapped her and who knows how many others for years also deserves a place on this list, which is why I made them an honorable mention here. But I do think that Dr. K being personally responsible for Venjix makes both characters more compelling, given how they handled it. Even though he lost the war for the planet in the end, his more than valiant effort, on top of the fact that he actually survives in the end, makes him an all-time great villain. Seriously, billions. Lord Zedd probably still stands as the best designed villain in all of Power Rangers. Everything about his aesthetic is chilling, eerie, and the stuff of nightmares. And I think the most important detail to the horror is the fact that he does look human in several respects, but with all his skin removed and only muscles and an exoskeleton remaining. The reason for that look also has an interesting origin, because Zedd lost his skin in an attempt to acquire the Zeo crystal sometime prior to the start of the actual show. If he was human, the clear metaphor would be the stripping away of his humanity for power. But what really makes him an all-time great villain, even beyond all of that, is his contrast to Zordon. Not just because both of their names start with the letter Z, but because, way more so than Rita, Zedd represents ultimate evil, from his backstory to his early actions. With Zedd, the plans became more sinister, more deadly, and more sophisticated than anything Rita could conjure up before him. So much so that the only thing keeping him from possibly topping this list are angry parents. As some of you know, Lord Zedd was so evil that Saban and friends were forced to tone him down, which included getting him married, and that did not bode well for the aforementioned deadliness of his plans. It became less about using temporal manipulation to depower the Rangers, and more about inducing junk food cravings. Really? What really holds him back more than anything, however, is the lack of any narratively significant bout with the Rangers. But, to be fair, it took the franchise a few years before they really got season finales just right, so what can you do? But, when you can scare kids and parents alike, you know that as an antagonist, you're doing something right. Or wrong? Not really sure. An all-time great villain that could have been even greater. Just like the Rangers in every way, except evil. That tagline speaks for itself, as well as being the perfect next step for the Space Rangers in their continued bout with evil. One of the best things about the Psycho Rangers is not their overwhelming need to destroy their color counterpart, although that was a good touch to create a baseline for many of their interactions, but the fact that the Rangers themselves were being pushed by them because the Psycho Rangers were by no means typical villains. The in-space team had to be more strategic, more vigilant, and more careful before and during every single fight with them. By this point, Quantrons were basically punching bags, and the villain of the week stuff is always predictable. But the Psycho Rangers introduced novel dynamics and added a ton of originality to how Power Rangers episodes in general compose themselves. It also gave birth to TJ coming up with one of the single greatest battle plans in all of Ranger history. Using the Psycho's color preference against them was a stroke of genius from a Blue Ranger that constantly proved during this season why he was leading the team last season. Dealing with a team of Psycho Rangers across 2 seasons is hard, but Lost Galaxy also proved that even one can be trouble. And with the revival of Psycho Pink came one of the most definitive moments in Power Rangers period, which completely reshaped how that season progressed tonally as well as story-wise. The Psycho Rangers weren't just powerful, they were crafty, driven, and willing to go to any length and use any tactic to defeat the Rangers, and for all of those reasons and more, all 5 collectively earned themselves a top 5 spot. Daishi being a great villain has a lot to do with 2 characters melding into one, and then their story becoming about portraying that duality. Daishi returns to the world thanks to Jared, a Paishoa pupil turned to darkness after he gets into a scuffle with Casey. This is important, because this conflict starts both characters on the road towards their destinies, and it's this conflict that's recreated on a larger scale when Casey goes against everyone's wishes in an effort to save Jared near the end of the season. That aforementioned duality rears its head many a time throughout the season, forcing you to question who's really in control. And just like Trakenna before him, Daishi also isn't the strongest antagonist in the show for a time, despite starting off as a capable fighter. Just like the Jungle Fury Rangers, Daishi has to learn from old masters in order to advance himself as a villain, because he realizes that they are the stronger ones right now. A point most of those masters are not shy about exploiting, since they blame Daishi for losing the original Beast War they keep mentioning. But he doesn't whine about that. Instead, he pushes himself harder, and eventually learns brand new powers along the way. This is also important because it goes back to how his character arc is connected and parallel to Casey's, who also isn't the strongest guy on his team early on. This leads to the Jared-Daishi duality hitting a breaking point, where they eventually begin to switch back and forth, which at this point is accomplished through Camille, which then spurs on Casey to take charge in his finest moment as he saves Jared's soul. Daishi and Jared are interesting because as antagonists, they are never in one place developmentally for very long. Early on, Daishi is clearly in charge. Then, after continually losing to the Rangers, powerful masters kick his ass repeatedly before he eventually learns to fight back. And part of learning to fight back early on includes confronting his human side in one of the season's best episodes, a side that even as Daishi, he didn't easily part from. A little later, he's in split personality mode, and lastly, Jared ends up helping stop his former worser half. It's a very active arc, but none of the individual parts are senselessly conceived, and the steps towards eventually resolving Jared and stopping Daishi were built up to from the very beginning, then progressed forward. He may never be as iconic or as menacing as other villains, but he's a much better character than most, an underrated character that fits really well into the narrative of the criminally underrated Jungle Fury. Time Force is an example of a season that's great because of how its narrative progression isn't just singularly focused. This story is almost as much about Ransik as it is about Wes or Jen. Ransik blames humanity for turning him into a mutant at a time when genetics have basically been mastered. But Jen then informs us that people did offer him help, people did try and reach out, and he refused them all. What could have been a more standard and sympathetic story almost from the start becomes a tale about just how far down the path of hatred one man is, a hatred that almost did him in because of what it once led him to do to Frax. Ransik's character arc essentially starts where Trakenna's arc ended, except for the fact that he has Nadira, who he does genuinely love. Ransik has done all manner of unforgivable things, and proves over the course of the series why mutants would rally around him. But just like Ecliptor before him, there's one thing that matters more than beating the Rangers or conquering the planet. When he's reached his breaking point, it's then where his humanity finally shines through, which leads to his surrender. That's never happened before in Power Rangers, but because the season began with him breaking out of containment, it makes perfect sense as a narrative close. It's powerful, also because it's a man finally realizing where he went wrong. He wasn't born to be evil, nor was he raised to be. He learned hatred. But by wanting to break the cycle of hatred, Nadira finally gets Ransik to see beyond evil, thus changing both of their destinies and eventually leading to them actually helping the Rangers during reinforcements from the future. And, fittingly enough, that episode featured Ransik confronting the mistakes of his past, similar to his conflict with Frax. Ransik is a great villain, no matter how you slice it, and there's a poetic nature to his resolution. He rejected humans for almost his entire life, but by giving in to his humanity, even as a mutant, he finally found peace. A man almost consumed by hatred lost, because love won, which, interestingly enough, is very par for the course in Time Force. Even with time-traveling superheroes, the season was always more about changing yourself, humanity, and the emotional highs and lows of those characters, and Ransik fits perfectly into that narrative to stand as one of Power Rangers' greatest villains. But who jumped in for the #1 spot? We'll get there, but first, some honorable mentions. The Princess of Darkness is the moment when Power Rangers as a series finally figured out not just how to make villains menacing, but how to create a genuinely captivating story with them. In Space is an all-time great season, and one of the biggest reasons why are the character dynamics at play. Astronema being Andros' sister is a great reveal, because it causes Astronema to then question everything she thought she knew, and the season takes their time with that too. They don't rush things with some dynamic transformation, and they certainly don't rush the reveal itself. They give her time to think things through and figure things out, like any normal person would. And the best part is, Ecliptor doesn't really keep her from doing that. They could have used him to force evil back down her throat, but instead, he more or less allows things to play out while still showing heavy concern for her. And all of this is a result of maybe the most tragic backstory of them all. Crone was abducted as a small, helpless child, and nobody could stop Darkonda from taking her. I can't even imagine how experiencing that must have affected Andros growing up, let alone their parents once they found out. One of my favorite scenes in all of Power Rangers is Crone simply asking Andros about their parents. It's at a time where the rest of the team still doesn't trust her yet, but she wants to reach out to her brother at least and start figuring out who she really is, where she really comes from. It's such a beautiful moment, because before then, Power Rangers didn't have that kind of layered, complex antagonist that could offer such a humanizing respite from the action. But with Astronema, you could always see that there was more to her than just being evil as early as her introduction. It was a cold and powerful opening moment that informed us that Astronema had no intentions of following the example of the wackier villains of yesteryear. She was literally raised to be different, and in many ways, better. But then, in recognizing her past, she becomes perhaps the most sympathetic villain in the franchise. And then, In Space does the smartest thing it can do by stripping away that humanity before the series can end. And now, we the audience find ourselves just as conflicted as the characters. For the first time in Power Rangers, we don't want the villain to completely lose. For the first time, we have a reason to be invested in their well-being and care if they make it out in the end. And generally speaking, that nuance is at the heart of what makes great villains in Power Rangers. It's not just they're bad, we're good. There's some gray mixed into the once black and white. It's not just monsters destroying cities. There's a story that demands telling. It's not just about the heroes. It's about how they connect to their specific antagonists and how that connection fosters the show both narratively and thematically. The Ranger world is filled with interesting, unique, and colorful villains, several of which make the seasons they come from exponentially better. But from where I'm standing, the Princess of Darkness reigns supreme. Don't forget to share your thoughts on the best Ranger villains and antagonists down below. And as always, thanks for watching.